Joining us now on the line from New York, New York, George Bonanno. He is professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University and the author of The Other Side of Sadness, What the New Science of Bereavement Tells Us About Life After Loss. George, good of you to join us on the line tonight. How are you?
Thank you. Very well. Very well. Nice to be with you.
Good. We've been exploring the whole idea around death and dying and aging on the program all week long, and we've wanted you in because of your work in the area of grief. And I want to start right there. The traditional idea of grief and the connection with Sigmund Freud and all that, give us sort of the background on that, if you would, to get us started.
Well, it goes way back to Freud, as you mentioned. And interestingly enough, Freud's ideas about bereavement and grief, which really were hit the print around 1917 in a paper of his called On Mourning and Melancholia. That model of mourning, of grief that he presented has really pretty much dominated the way we thought about grief in the Western world. And in that model, Freud used the phrase the work of mourning. So he emphasized the elaborateness, the drawn-out nature of grieving, that grieving was something like work.
A job in some respects then. Is that right?
A demanding job, yeah. And it was something he had kind of assumed that this was something that everybody would have to go through, this drawn-out working through process. And Freud talked about it in terms of reviewing every single one of the memories and associations associated, the ideas associated with a lost loved one, a kind of painstakingly reviewing everything until you can finally let go.
Now, I gather in more recent years, the 5 stages of Kubler-Ross have become increasingly popular. Again, by way of background, why don't you help us, remind us what those 5 stages are?
Well, the idea of work, as I mentioned, had taken off and kind of become the norm. And then around sometime in the 60s, Kubler-Ross proposed that grieving went through 5 stages. I can't tell you what they are because I can't remember. Something like denial, depression, it really doesn't matter because it really doesn't make much sense. Originally, those 5 stages were proposed for what people go through when they're facing their own death. Kubler-Ross worked with people who are facing dying, which is a completely different situation, a very different cup of tea. And the 5 stages were kind of mapped onto bereavement by other people. People just kind of extrapolated. And eventually Kubler-Ross herself decided, well, why not? And decided to talk about them in terms of facing grieving also, facing the loss of a loved one. But what we've seen in our research, in fact, is that we've never seen anything remotely like stages. People don't go through stages, at least in any predictable way or any kind of uniform way across people.
Well, what's interesting, I guess, about your answer is, and I'm not surprised you have not committed to memory what the 5 stages are and that you reject them, because I think she did as well as she approached her own death. So perhaps not too shocking that this is no longer the theory in vogue, but tell me, you're very categorical about this. There are no 5 stages, and you reject her theories.
Yes.
How come?
Yes. Well, even when I published the book that I just published, The Other Side of Sadness, I barely paid any mind to the 5 stages because we've seen nothing remotely like that in the grieving process. And it was really only in working with the publisher and the media covering the book that we kind of began to focus a little bit more on the 5 stages. And I frankly was somewhat surprised that they were as widely accepted as they were, because when we interview lots and lots of bereaved people, which is essentially what we do in our research, we bring in many, many people into the laboratory over time and follow them over time to see what their course is. We essentially see maybe 3 patterns across people. Some people show one pattern, some people show another, some people show another. And the most common pattern is really a fairly quick experience of discomfort and distress related to the loss, and then a fairly stable trajectory of health across time, essentially a flat trajectory. There are periodic bits of sadness and distress that people experience, but essentially nothing remotely like those 5 stages.
Now, that's certainly not the conventional wisdom. So where do you think this resilience of ours comes from?
Well, that's a great question. It's something we're trying to figure out right now. So when we first began, and I should say we've been doing this probably about 20 years now, is following people over time, and it became overwhelmingly clear that the majority of people are resilient. Not everybody, but the majority of people are resilient. And resilient people are not free of pain. I want to make that very clear. They do feel distress, they do feel intense sadness, but they cope with that and they can keep functioning. So one of the ways, and we think about, so what is it about resilient people? How is it that we're so resilient? And it seems to be, based on what we've learned so far, that it partly has to do, or to a large extent has to do with the fact that we're wired with emotional reactions that are extremely helpful in dealing with challenging life situations. And the one emotion that's associated with loss is sadness. So we are come equipped with sadness. And the emotion of sadness is extremely effective. It's what we have it for. Sadness is not a byproduct, not some accidental thing. It appears that we've evolved sadness to help us deal with these kinds of situations.
Well, let me follow up then on this wiring as you've described it. The conventional wisdom is if we don't grieve today adequately, we will experience a much more traumatic episode later on. Have you got any research to back that up?
We've looked at that very point a number of times, and there's absolutely no evidence for that. What we see are that when people cope very well, many people cope very well, not everybody, when people cope very well, that's it. And it's the notion somehow that if you're, I think it mostly was applied to people who coped well, and there was somehow this assumption that they were in denial and that they would have delayed manifestations of grief. There are some possible ways to look to where that came from historically, but we just don't see it over time. We followed people for 5 years in one study, for longer in another study, and we just simply do not see that pattern.
So friends have got to stop telling other friends, come on, cry it out now, or else it's going to be worse down the road. You say it's just not on.
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely the case. And it's really comes from a kind of a 19th century view of grieving, that somehow grief is in us and it's got to come out. And if it doesn't come out, that it will fester. And that's just simply, there's nothing we've learned in neuroscience and psychological research, nothing has remotely looks like that. So we don't have mechanisms like that.
How about this, George? How does sadness and being sad help us through our grief?
Yes. Okay. The way it appears to work, and I say appears because I'm always very cautious as a scientist, but based on many, many studies now, we've learned that sadness has functions. Sadness does things. That's why we have sadness. One of the functions of sadness is when we feel sad, we turn our attention inward. Our heart rate slows down. We slow down. The world seems to slow down. We stop paying as much attention to what's going on around us, and we look internally. We reflect and take stock. We actually become more accurate, and there's a phrase, sadder but wiser. And in experimental studies, we can make people sad, and when we make people sad, they're actually more accurate in the estimates they make, and they're less prone to stereotypes. They're seeing the world, in a sense, more clearly. And when we become sad, we then take stock. We, in a sense, face up to the fact that the person we have loved or been so connected to, even hated at times, the person that was important to us, that person is no longer there, no longer going to be there in the actual physical sense. And we have to come to terms with that, because most of the time we interact with people, we interact with them in our heads anyway. The people that we're close to, often we're not with them, so we're having an ongoing dialogue with them in our heads. We may continue to do that when a person is gone, when a person is passed on, but we have to come to terms with the fact that they have actually died and they're physically not present. It's an obvious fact, but it takes us a while to do that. So sadness allows us to do that. We turn inward and do that. And that's really what we have to do when we lose a loved one.
Okay,
it's
but
a fairly simple thing.
Less obvious would be the role that laughing or smiling might play in helping us get over. You would think there's no room for that when you're trying to go through the grieving process. Not true, I presume.
Yeah. No, not true at all. And the reason is, and this is crucial, and I think this is an important point that I would love the world to know, because it's so far not widely known, is that when we have intense emotions like sadness, they are not steady states. They come and go. We don't stay sad from this point for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 months. We're not, say we're feeling grief for 3 months. We're not sad continually for those 3 months. It's a state that comes and goes. We're wired that way. If we were sad for 3 months, we would just collapse with exhaustion afterwards. So what happens is, with all emotions are very short, and they come and go. We go in and out of states of sadness. When we come out of the state of sadness temporarily, even during bereavement, even early on after a loss, we actually temporarily can kind of forget that the loss had happened. We're simply not thinking about it. And then we might go in for another episode of sadness. We kind of go in and out of that state. When we come out of the sad state, we're much more attuned again with other people around us. We're much more interactive and social and connected to other people. And it's in those moments that we actually can laugh and smile and have genuine positive memories and emotions. And most of the laughter that we see when people are grieving is in terms of connections with other people. It's an interpersonal laughter, a sharing of a laugh with other people. And it's extremely common.
You're going to forgive me, I hope, here for turning this discussion from the academic to the personal, but I want people who are watching us to know that you're not just going from studies here. You've been through this. When did your father pass away?
My father passed away in 1979.
What did he pass away from?
He died of a heart attack. He'd had a number of heart attacks earlier. He was in very poor health. And he died, I think it was his third heart attack. In very bad shape. He was diabetic, he was overweight, and just not doing well.
And how old were you when all this happened?
See, I was 23 at the time.
Which feels pretty young.
Pretty young, and you know, I knew my father was in very poor health. We had not been getting along for a number of years, my father and I. We had a lot of unresolved business. I remember thinking when I was younger, say in my early teens, I remember thinking, what would it be like if my father died? Because I knew that he was ill. And a friend of mine had lost his father, and I remember at the time thinking, how could he possibly deal with that? And my father died, and when he died, it came as something of a relief, because he had been so unhappy and in such poor health for the last number of years. And I was quite surprised by that. I had no knowledge of bereavement or psychology, anything at the time. I was not in college at the time. But I would remember, you know, being quite surprised by that this does happen.
Surprised by the relief you felt?
Surprised by the relief I felt, you know, and at first I thought, well, is this okay? And I've learned since that this is a common reaction people have. They're not sure they're entitled to feel relief. You know, I felt sadness as well, and I felt a desire to honor my father, and I did a few personal things to honor my father, you know, and then attended the memorial service with my family and thought about him a lot. I've still thought about my father a great deal over the years. In a sense, we have an ongoing relationship because he's, you know, as a young man, when one loses one's father, you still have to kind of talk with your inner father, for lack of a better word. But his loss, his death was actually, you know, it came as somewhat a relief because his life was so difficult, and it was something I dealt with, and I was somewhat surprised at how well I dealt with it, which is something I've subsequently learned that's a common reaction that people have,
and when
they cope well with loss.
That relationship that you continue to have with him, I think I read that you were on an elevator one day and started talking to him. What was that all about?
Well, I've had a number of conversations with my father, and it's an interesting activity. I do it from time to time. I was always very self-conscious about it, and being at the time a graduate student in psychology and now a professor of psychology, you know, I find I do it in the elevator because in my building, I live in New York, and the elevator is very old and very slow. It takes a long time for the doors to open. You know, the elevator kind of comes to the floor, and it can't quite decide if it's going to stop, and then it stops, then the doors slowly open. So I have lots of time before anybody can catch me talking with my father. You know, and I'm well aware that my father is dead. I don't have any concrete beliefs about a spirit following me around and things like that. But I do have I have gained quite a sense of comfort from speaking with my father in the past. You know, I found when I first just needed his advice, I could actually call out to him and talk with him, and I could imagine or sense what he might have said, and it was kind of like having him there. And I've since learned that many people do such things. Interestingly, what we found in our research is that in cultures where that's more widely accepted, for example, in China and among Chinese peoples, particularly among Chinese peoples who are not in China, because there's in a way greater acceptance of Chinese culture outside of China. that it's very common for people to have a sense of a connection to a lost loved one and to interact with that lost loved one. And we find it's very adaptive. It's harder for people in North America and in Europe to do it because it's seen as kind of an odd thing to do. It's not culturally sanctioned in Western countries. So people feel a little bit odd about doing it in Western countries.
So in our last minute here then, if the advice would be going forward, loosen up a little bit, everybody. Don't worry about how it looks. The Chinese have got some good ideas on this, and maybe we've got something to learn from them.
Well, we certainly have something to learn from other cultures. I don't know how well or how easily people can do such things in this culture. My experience was actually in China that when I did engage in such practices in China, they were much more comforting and adaptive and useful because there it was okay. And I found I don't engage in the practices here so much. So we do have things to learn from other countries, absolutely. I think maybe perhaps people can kind of figure out where they stand on such things themselves.
Name of the book, once again, The Other Side of Sadness. George Bonanno, it's awfully good of you to join us from Columbia University and New York City tonight. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.